Hey guys, Mr. G here. In the past couple of videos, we've been graphing trigonomic functions, specifically sine and cosine, with all the four transformations. Now, in the past videos, we've made x and y tables. We used the numbers that were in the same spot as A, B, C, and D to change the x and y values in the table and then graph the coordinates. So I wanted to do things a little bit differently just to kind of show you guys you don't need to make an x and y table to graph trig functions. All we really need to do is to label the information that we're given, specifically numbers represents A, B, C, and D. All right. And in this video, I'm gonna go over a majority of the transformations that we've been looking at. And I wanna show you guys one new piece of information that will be very helpful to make our graphs without needing an x and y table. All right, so we already know the amplitude. We already know how to find the period of a trig function. We were exposed to finding the phase shift, which is also known as a horizontal shift, and we have the vertical shift. And whatever number we're given in the vertical shift, that will help us determine the midline, the max line, and the min line. All right. And to figure out the max and the min line, we use the numbers that for A and D. All right. Now, there's one more thing that I want to talk about, which is quarters. All right. So quarters tells you the distance between each x value. All right. And to figure out the quarters, what we're going to do is once we figured out the period, we're going to go ahead and divide that by 4. All right. So for each of the examples, we're going to identify numbers for A, B, C, and or D. We're going to see if we can fill in all of these majority of the information. All right. So that way we don't need to make an x and y table. Now, before I do that, let's recall the original graphs for sine and cosine. All right. So over here, I have the original graph for sine of x. We start off with 0, 0, which is a midpoint. Then we have pi over 2, 1, which is a max. We have pi, 0, which is a midpoint. We have 3 pi over 2, negative 1, which is a min. And we have 2 pi, 0, which is a mid. So the pattern for the graph of sine would be mid, max, mid, min, mid. And we're going to use this pattern to help us graph without using the x and y table. And then we have cosine. In the cosine, we have 0, 1, which is the max, pi over 2, 0, which is a mid, pi, negative 1, which is a min, 3 pi over 2, 0, which is a mid, and 2 pi, 1, which is a max. So the pattern for a graph of cosine is max, mid, min, mid, max. So hopefully the pattern will help us remember how the graph or the trig function looks like. So let's go ahead and look at some examples so that we can graph without having to use an x and y table. Okay, so let's start off with number 1, which we have 2 times sine of 1/2 x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label what numbers I have for A, B, C, and or D. All right, so let's start off with A. We have B, we have C, and we have D. Okay? So if we take a look, we see that 2 is in the same spot as A. So A is going to equal to 2. B is in the same spot as 1/2. We have C. There really is no number that's in the same spot as C. So I'm just going to label that as 0. And same thing for D. There is no number that is being added or subtracted to the whole trig function, so that's gonna be 0 as well. All right? So now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to find my amplitude, the period, the quarters, and all the lines, the midline, the max line, and the min line. All right? So let's go ahead and figure that out. So let me use the different colors. So we have the amplitude. So I'm gonna write amp for short. Now the amplitude, we usually take the absolute value of A, and taking the absolute value of 2 is still 2. So my amplitude is 2 units. All right? And then we have the period. All right? So with the period, I'm going to take 2 pi and divide it by a half. All right? So with that, we're taking a whole number, which is in form of a radian, and dividing it by a fraction. So this is where I would need to do the keep, change, flip. I keep this, I change the division into multiplication, and I flip the 1/2. So now I can read this as 2 pi times 2, which will give me 4 pi. All right? So now we're going to go ahead and figure out the quarters. So the quarters, I'm going to take my period, which is 4 pi, and divide it by 4. So if I do that, I just end up with pi. So that means that to get from one x value to the next, we're going by pi. All right? Okay, so now we're almost done. There is no C for phase shift, and there is no D for vertical shift. So that means that my midline is just going to be y equals to 0. So let me go ahead and write out the midline. So that way I'll be able to figure out the max and the min line. So midline, we have y equals to the number for D, which is 0. We have the max line. So I'm going to take my y and I'm going to take my 0 and add it to my amplitude, which is 2. And I get positive 2. And then my min line, I have y equals to 0 minus 2, and I get negative 2 for my minimum. All right? Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Perfect. All right. So we're going to go ahead and graph the given function with all the information that we're given. Okay? So I'm going to graph this over here. So we have 2, 1, 0, -1, -2. All right. Oh, I always keep hitting the thing that holds the phone. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and we already filled the y values with the amplitude. So now I'm going to fill in the x values. So we start off as 0. And if you guys recall, with the quarters, my quarter is pi. So that means to get from one number to the next, we're going up by a pi. So we have 0, then we go from 0 to pi. And then if I add another pi, we go from pi to 2 pi. And then we go from 2 pi to, if I add another pi to 2 pi, we get 3 pi. And then if I add another pi to 3 pi, we get 4 pi. And 4 pi is the period of this graph. So that means that after 4 pi, the pattern starts to repeat. So now we're dealing with a sine function. We have sine of x. So I'm going to take the original graph. Let me just fold this over here. I'm going to take the original graph for sine of x and follow the pattern to get me the graph for this one. So originally, I'm at the midline. Oh, before that, let me identify the max, the line for max, the line for mid, and the line for min. All right? All right, so let's go ahead. So we have 0, 0, which is my point on the midline. So it's still going to be in the same spot. So now I'm going to go from my midpoint to my max. So the next point to come would be pi, 2. If you guys recall, the maximum are all of the points at 2. Then I go from, we have mid, max, mid. So I'm going to go from max to mid. All right. And then I have mid to minimum. And then min to mid. All right. And then I'm going to connect my points using a red pen. Okay. So we have our graph for 2 times sine of 1/2 x. And all we really needed to do was use the pattern from the original graph. We used the information that we identified for amplitude, period, quarters, and all of the lines over here. All right, so we're gonna do that same exact technique for the rest of the problems. So let's go ahead with number 2, which we have sine of x minus pi over 4. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna label my numbers for A, B, C, and D. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure that out. So starting off with A, there is no number in front of sine, so that means that my coefficient is going to be 1. All right, now for B, there is no number in front of x, so that means that my coefficient for x is going to be 1. We see that pi over 4 is in the same spot as C, so C is going to be pi over 4. And then we have D, and there is no number for D that is being added or subtracted. So that means that my number for D is going to be 0. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and use whatever I labeled for A, B, C, and D to figure out my amplitude, period, quarters, and all the 3 lines. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the amplitude. So with the amplitude, I take the absolute value of A, which is 1, and it's still going to be 1. So my amplitude is 1 unit. All right, so then we have the period. So we're going to take the period. So we have 2 pi divided by my B, which is 1. And if you do 2 pi divided by 1, you still get 2 pi. And then we have quarters. So I'm going to take 2 pi, and divide it by 4. That's what I meant when I said 4. And if I were to simplify 2 pi over 4, I end up with pi over 2. So my quarters are pi over 2. That means to get from one x value to the next, I'm going by pi over 2 radians, or 90 degrees. And then we have something new that we didn't have in number 1, which is a number for C, which is part of the phase shift. So now I actually have a phase shift going on. So to figure out the phase shift, which I'm going to write over here, so I have pi over 4 for C, and if I divide that by my B, which is still 1, I end up with pi over 4. All right? And if we take a look at the sign, we see that originally we have a minus. And remember, a phase shift follows the same rule as a horizontal shift, where we follow the opposite sign. So the opposite of a minus is a plus, and for a horizontal direction, the right direction is a positive direction. It's a plus direction. So for the phase shift, I move pi over 4 to the right. all right? So then we have one more, which are the lines. So I'm gonna go ahead and figure out the max line, the mid line first, the max line, and the min line, all right? So let me see, I'm gonna box this. And I have these, so I'm going to use over here. So I have my midline. So I'm just gonna write mid. So my midline would be the number for D, which in this case is 0. So my midline would be y equals to 0. And then we have the max, where I take 0 and add it to the A, which is 1, and I get 1. And then for my min, I take 0 and subtract it to 1 for the A, and I get -1. All right? So I have all of my pieces of information that will help me graph sine of x minus pi over 4. All right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and make the graph. So somewhere where it has more space, so over here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and label my y values. So one, we have the max line. Y equals to 0 is the midline. And then we have -1, which is the min line. Min, not mid, min. All right, so we have our 3 lines, and I'm gonna write out the x coordinates. Okay, so we know that the period we end at 2 pi, and we're going up by pi over 2. However, we have a phase shift, meaning that we're moving pi over 4 to the right. So that means that the whole graph is going to move pi over 4 radians to the right side, or 45 degrees to the right. All right? So what that means is, let's say we were to start at 0, right? If I were to move pi over 4 to the right from 0, I end up starting at pi over 4. All right. So then now to get from one number to the next, I take my quarter, which is pi over 2, and add it to pi over 4 to figure out what my next number is going to be. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding each x value to pi over 2. So I take pi over 4 and I add it to pi over 2. So I'm going to take my calculator and I'm going to just add the fractions. So pi over 4 would be 1/4. All right. And then I add it to 1/2 because pi over 2 is written as 1/2. And what I get is 3 pi over 4. So my next x value I go from pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4. All right. So now I'm going to do that again to go from 3 pi over 4 to another radian. So I have 3/4. So I'm not going to use the pi. I'm just going to use the number. So 3/4 plus 1/2. All right, I'm going to write it as an improper fraction. So I hit second and then ABC to DE. I get 5 pi over 4. All right, so I can kind of see a pattern going on where I'm going from 1 pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4 to 5 pi over 4. So based on the pattern that's happening, I can easily assume that this next one would be 7 pi over 4. And then the next one would be 9 pi over 4. So these are my x values for the graph based on based on the phase shift and for each x value, we're going up by pi over 2. All right. So I'm going to start off at pi over 4. Since originally we were to start at 0, but we're moving pi over 4 to the right. So I'm going to use the pattern for sine to get my graph. So I have the pattern. So starting at min, so 0, so pi over 4 comma 0. Then at max, 3 pi over 4 comma 1. Back at min, 5 pi over 4 comma 0. Then going down to mid, 7 pi over 4 comma negative 1. Then back to min, we're at 9 pi over 4 comma 0. I'm going to connect my points. And here we have our graph for sine of x minus pi over 4. All right. So far so good. We're able to get the graphs without having to use an x and y table. So now we're going to move on to number 3, and I'm going to do the same exact technique. So for number 3, I'm going to label my numbers for A, B, C, and D. So I have A, B, C, D. So A is in the same spot as 3, B is 2, C. If we compare the format of the function to this function, we see that there really is no radian that's being added or subtracted to b of x. So that means that my C is going to be 0 radians. And then D, we have -1. So my D is -1. All right? So now I'm going to go ahead and figure out majority of the information. So I have the amplitude. So the amplitude, I take the absolute value of A. So the absolute value of 3 is still 3 units. Then we have to figure out the period. So at the period, I take 2 pi and divide it by my B, which is 2, and I get pi. All right? Then I have the quarters. All right, so with the quarters, I'm going to take pi and divide it by 4. And there's really nothing to simplify. So my quarters, I'm going each x value by pi over 4. Okay? And then for C, there is no phase shift, so we're good on that. So now all I need to figure out is the midline, the max line, and the min line. So I have my mid. So y equals to the number for D, which in this case is -1. We have max. So I take my -1 and add it to my A, which is 3, and I get a +2. Then I have my min. So I take my y value, which is -1, and subtract it to 3, and I get -4. All right? So I have all my pieces of information for me to graph. Okay? So let me go ahead and box this. Okay. So let's go ahead and graph my function. So I have -4, so -1, well, +2, +2, 1, 0, 1, -1, -2, oh, let me see, -3 and -4, because I'm running out of space. You guys get the idea. Then I'm going to label my x-axis. Okay, so I start off at 0 for x, and with the quarters, I'm going by pi over 4. So I go from 0 to pi over 4, and then I add pi over 4 to another pi over 4. I get 2 pi over 4. And we could simplify 2 pi over 4 and we get pi over 2. So then I have pi over 2 plus pi over 4. That will give me 3 pi over 4. And then I add 3 pi over 4 to pi over 4, and I get 4 pi over 4. And we can simplify 4 over 4 to just get 1. So it's just going to be 1 pi. And luckily, that is my period. So I can stop over here. And I'm going to go ahead and try to graph my function. But before that, let me label the line for max, mid, and min, which is at -4. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to use a pattern for the original graph for cosine, so that way I'll be able to graph the new one. So I start off at the max point, so it would be 0, 2. Then I go from max to mid, so pi over 4, 0. Then mid to min, pi over 2, -4. Then mid to min, 3 pi over 4, 0. And then mid to max, pi over pi, 2. And then connect my points. And there we have it. Cool. We got my graph for 3 times cosine of 2x. So far so good. We're really doing a good job not needing an x and y table to graph. All right, so let's go ahead and finish this video off with this 4th problem. So I'm going to label all my numbers for A, B, C, and D. Let's go ahead and do that. So I have A, B, C, and D. So for A, I have -2. B, I have +2. C, I have 2 pi. And D, I have +1. All right? So now I'm going to go ahead and figure out all the information, starting with the amplitude. So we're going to go ahead and figure out my amplitude. So I'm going to write this over here. So I have the amplitude. So I take the absolute value of -2. So now that we have a negative, and the absolute value of that would be a +2. So I have 2 units. All right. So then we're going to move on to figuring out the period. So I'm going to take 2 pi and divide it by b, which in this case is 2. I get pi, which is 180. So that means that the period is pi radians. All right. So now let's go ahead and figure out the quarters. So for the quarters, I take my pi divided by 4. And it just stays as pi over 4. All right, so that means that to get from one x value to the next, I'm going by pi over 4. All right, and then we have a phase shift going on. So phase shift. So for the phase shift, I take my c, my value for c, which is 2 pi, and divide it by my value for b, which is 2. And once I divide those two numbers, specifically 2 and 2, I just end up with pi. So my phase shift, my horizontal shift, is going to be pi radians. And if we were to follow the rule for horizontal shifts, we usually follow the opposite sign. So we're given a minus. So the opposite of a minus is a plus. And the right direction is the plus direction, the positive direction. So I'm going to go pi radians to the right. All right. So then we have our lines, the mid line, the max line, and the min line. All right. But things may be a little bit different based on having an actual negative over here. Let's see what happens. So we have the mid line. Move this up. So we have the mid line. I take my y is going to equal to my value for d, which in this case is 1. And then I have my max line. So I take y, and if I were to follow the formula, I add it to my a, which is -2, and I end up with -1. And then if I would have the min line, I have y equals to 1 minus a -2. Double negatives make a positive, so that's going to end up as a +3. So we're kind of see something off going here, because we take a look, we have our midline, which is a 1, but my min line is labeled as y equals to 3, and my max line is y equals to -1. That doesn't seem right, because if we were to look at the numbers in order, 3 is the maximum and 1 is the minimum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cross max, and this is going to be my min line, and I'm going to cross out min, and this is going to be my max line. All right, so let me just cross this out further. And this all happened just because we had the -2 that was in the front. It affected the pattern for the cosine, for the graph of the cosine. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and graph my function with the pieces of information that we have. All right, so I'm gonna graph it over here. So let me see, you have 3, 1, 2, 3, -1. All right, so we have 3 as the max, 1 as the mid, and -1 as the min. All right, okay, so let's go ahead and use the pattern for cosine to get my graph. Now, originally the pattern would be max, mid, min, mid, max. However, since we have the negative in the front, it's gonna affect it. Now, if you guys recall the graph transformations, if we have a negative in the front, there's a certain kind of transformation that's gonna happen. If you guys said a reflection around the x-axis, then you're absolutely right. So that means that the graph from the original one is gonna flip horizontal, is gonna flip towards the x-axis. And instead of the graph opening up, it's gonna open down. All right? But before that, let's label the x-axis 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So we would start off at 0. And then my quarters, I'm going each x value by pi over 4, all right? However, if we're taking a look, the phase shift over here, the whole entire graph is gonna move pi to the right. So that means that everything is gonna move to the right direction in pi, all right? So originally we would start off at 0. However, I'm gonna start off at pi, since that's the phase shift that's happening. However, to get from one x value to the next, I'm gonna add each by pi over 4. All right, add each by pi over 4 to see what my x values are gonna be on the on the graph. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my pi, which is 1, and I'm gonna add it to pi over 4, which in this case would be 1/4. All right, and then I can set it up as improper fraction. I get 5 pi over 4. All right, 5 pi over 4. And then I add 5 pi over 4 to pi over 4. Luckily, the denominators are the same, so I would end up with 6 pi over 4. And if you simplify 6/4, it would become 3 pi over 2. All right. So then I add 3 pi over 2 to pi over 4. I would change 3 pi over 2 to make the denominators the same. So 6 pi over 4. And 6 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 would be 7 pi over 4. And then I add 7 pi over 4 to pi over 4. It would be 8 pi over 4, which if I simplify, it would be 2 pi. Okay, so we got our x values for the graph. And now we're gonna start off, instead of at 0, we're gonna start off at pi, since we're moving pi to the right. And if you guys recall, the graph is going to reflect. So instead of starting off at the max, we're gonna start off at the min. So we're gonna be actually going mid, we're gonna be going as mid, min, not mid, min, mid, max, mid, min. So let's go ahead and do that. We have our mid, which is at -1, max, Oh, max, I mean, not max. Mid, min. Max, mid, then min. Connect my points. And we have our graph. All right, so this will be my graph for negative 2 times cosine of 2x minus 2 pi plus 1. All right, so I hope this video was helpful for you guys to be able to graph without using the x and y table. But if you do feel like x and y table is still helpful for you to use, you can use it by any means. Hope you guys enjoy the video. Have a wonderful day.